Hey everyone, so this is question 1.8. It's called zero matrix, and for this question, we're passed like an asymmetrical array, so the number of columns does not equal the number of rows in this 2D matrix. So here we have 3 columns in our array, and then we have 4 rows, so that would be like a 4 by 3 matrix. And what we want to do is we want to iterate through this 2D matrix, and whenever we encounter a 0, such as this one, we want to set the entire column that it's in, so this value, and this value, all to zeros, and then we want to set the entire row that it's in all to zeros, so that would be this value and this value. So in this test case that we have here, I just have to go back to it. It would look like this as a result because we just set, there's a 0 here. So we set all these values to 0, this one, this one, this one, and then we set these to 0. And then because there's 0 here, like I said, we set all these values to 0 and the values above it. So only these two values kind of in the middle would not be kind of nullified or 0. So you can just ignore this. This is just a print statement to print our result when we're done. But we have this function here that we call zero matrix, and we're just passing our 2D array. Now, usually I kind of implement the answer for this step by step, but there's a lot of for loops and if statements, so it's kind of annoying to type it all out, and it's not very valuable to do it. So I've already implemented the solution. So what we have to do initially is, or not initially, it's good practice to have 2 separate methods because we kind of perform these actions quite a few times. So this nullify column method is just used so that we can pass a column to this method along with our 2D matrix. And we can say, okay, set column 1 to 0. So it would go through and just set that entire column 1 to 0. And we kind of have the same thing for nullify row, which we pass in the row that we want to set the entire row to 0. And so if we set row 2 to 0, it would look like this. So to do this, what we want to do is you have to kind of, for this question, think about how we want to indicate which rows and which columns have 0 in it. So the simple way to do it, which isn't optimal, but we would have 2 arrays called like rows and columns, or columns, if you want a long name, columns with 0 in it. But these would contain essentially, so in this example, the 0 index row has a 0 in it, or like the first row has a 0 in it. So we'll set that to 0. And then the 4th row, or the 3rd index, also has a 0 in it. So we would set that to 3. So essentially the 0th row and the 3rd row has a 0 in it. And then you would iterate and find which columns have a 0 in it. So the 0th column, or the first column, has a 0 in it. And then the last column of the array has a 0 in it, which is the 2nd index. So, and then with these 2 arrays, you would just kind of iterate through the rows list and just pass in, okay, nullify the 0th row, and then nullify the 3rd row index. And then you would iterate through the columns, and you would say, okay, nullify the 0, and then nullify the 2nd index column. But there is a smarter way to do this. I would recommend you implement this easier way first. But the kind of smarter, or more complicated but more space efficient way to do this, so we're just using the space that's provided to us in this matrix, is we're actually using the first row, which is this one, and the first column, which is this one, to indicate where there are zeros. So for this element, to indicate that there's a 0 here, we would then set this number 3 to 0, and then in the first column, but I guess fourth row, we would set that to 0. And so it's kind of where they intersect is where the 0 is. So if we had a 0 here, we would send this to 0, and we would set this location to 0, just to indicate that there's a 0 in this column, in this row. So one important check that you want to do initially is check if the first row and the first columns have 0 in it. So that would be this 0 here. The first row does have 0 in it, and the first column, which is this one, also has 0 in it. Same 0, but that would mean that we are actually setting all these values to 0, and we're setting all these values to 0. Now, we simply use a Boolean variable to track this, because if we right away set all of these to 0, then we wouldn't be able to know where, these values have 0 in it. And so you kind of just want to set a Boolean array if the row 1 has 0 and if column 1 has a 0. And it's kind of like our last step at the end to nullify that first row and that first column if it did have it. So that's kind of the final step. So you just want to store whether or not the first column row have a 0 in it and use that knowledge to the very end. So after you make those quick checks, what we're going to do is we check if all the cells that aren't in the first row and first column have 0s in it. And we're kind of going to do the algorithm that I described before where, and I'll just run the code here now that I uncommented it, where, okay, it iterates through this value, then this, and this. So just this rectangle here that is not in the first row and first column. And so this is a 3, this is a 3, this one's a 3, 3, 3, and then it reaches here and it goes, okay, we're going to set this value to 0 here to indicate that this column has a 0 in it. And then we're going to set this row to 0 in the first column to indicate that the fourth row has 0 in it. Great, so then I'll just uncomment the next line of code. We're going to read through the first row and we're going to set the entire row to 0 if there's a 0 in it. So that would be this row here, I believe, if we just run it. Great, so essentially we're iterating through actually the first column, and here we had a 0 to indicate that there's a 0 in it, so we set this entire value to 0. Now we're avoiding nullifying here, and although there's a 0 in it, because we're starting like at the first index, and we don't want to indicate, the whole first row and first column to 0 because we're doing that at the very end. So we kind of want to stay outside of the bounds within here. So we ignore this 0 and we get down to here. We see that there's 0 in it. So we set all these values to 0. And then now we want to read in from these columns, and we're going to avoid this 0, but we're going to set this entire column to 0. So great, so that looks like that. We now set these two values to 0, and we're still ignoring the first row and first column. And so we set all those to 0. And then now, with the values that we stored from earlier, we said before that yes, the first row did contain a 0 in it, so we're going to set it to 0. Like so. Those are now 0. And then, like we saw before, the first column did have 0 in it. It was this position here. So it's going to set these two values to 0. Great, and just like that, and that's the expected result that we wanted. So once again, this has a space complexity of 0,1. So because we're just using the matrix that was provided to us, we can just use a void function. I think I'm actually returning it, but yeah, I don't really need to. It's in place. And otherwise, we would have required, two additional arrays if we were kind of using that simpler approach, which, hopefully you tried before this method. And then it has a space complexity of O(n) squared. Now, some people just call this O of, oh, I messed up there. Some people just call this O of n because it's kind of constant time in terms of the size of your input. But then some people word this as O(n) squared because in terms of, your columns by rows or rows by columns. So it's kind of up to you, but I usually call it O of n because it's constant in terms of the size of your input. So yeah, I hope I helped there, and good luck with the rest of it. Have a great day.